Hello again and welcome back. I am Jared Case, curator of film exhibitions at the Dryden Theater and the George Eastman Museum. We've got another streaming recommendation as part of a conversation with another of our Selznick graduates. Today I have Justin LaLiberty with us, graduate from 2011, who now works at Vinegar Syndrome, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that. Hello, Justin.
Hi. Yes, so I work for Vinegar Syndrome now. It is a small boutique home video label out of Connecticut, and we specialize in restoring and preserving genre film. So horror movies, action movies, sci-fi, thrillers, and putting them out on Blu-ray, UHD, some streaming, just kind of getting them out there and making them accessible.
And you mentioned some of the genres, but can you mention maybe some titles? What are your popular titles that people may have seen on the shelves?
The biggest ones are probably recently we put out The Beastmaster on UHD and 4K. That was one that made people really excited. So things that are kind of hitting nostalgia boxes. And then we put out Tammy and the T-Rex, which is really fun, and Rad, which is a BMX movie from the 80s. And then more horror geared stuff like Spookies, Graduation Day, kind of working with some companies like Troma and MGM, putting out things in their catalogs that haven't really been presented as well before. And we also do things that are, international. So we've been working with these Forgotten Giallo box sets. And recently we put out 2 of those. So trying to bring in some Italian cinema and some Spanish cinema, Mexican horror, titles like Cemetery of Terror and Don't Panic. So it's kind of making it as international as possible while also sticking with the breadth of genre cinema.
And your job is very involved with distribution. And this is the first conversation we've had with a graduate on this side of it. But there is a collection. A large part of your job when you're not stuck at home is the archive and the collection that you have.
Yeah, so I came on as a film archivist for the company, and it's a very large archive. It's all film, 1635. We don't really have any 70 millimeter. There's some 8 millimeter in there. But yeah, it's a very large collection, and it runs from preprint elements through projection prints, and yeah, it's climate controlled. It's a large sort of warehouse that we're holding all the film in, and it needed to be kind of organized and cataloged, and that's where I came in to really get in there and catalog everything, rehouse things. So we're rehousing, things from metal cans to Tuscan Provent cans, and so making everything findable. I mean, that was the big goal, was to make the elements searchable in a database and also, able to be picked for scanning and for shipping, however we need to use them.
Yeah, as we've talked over the years, one of the biggest things that struck me about what you were doing there was this intellectual control. So much of the archive is knowing what you have and how to find it. And I got the sense that there was some work to be done when you got there.
Yeah, I mean, things were kept well, which is great. You come in and like the first thing you hope for is that the room's climate controlled and that the film isn't decomposing everywhere, and that was luckily not the case. It was well kept, which is really good, but there wasn't really much of a system in place for organizing everything. So I came in, I had to develop a system for a database to make everything input into there and searchable, and then also mapping out the physical space. So labeling, shelving, kind of coming up with a system for traffic, which was really important. It was something that I didn't think of before getting in there, was how does stuff enter the archive and exit the archive, and how does it get scanned and put back? These things that just seem like you enter a place like the Eastman House and that system's already there, so you don't really question it. But when you go into a place that doesn't have that yet and you have to kind of start from the bottom, you really notice like how important those systems being in place are.
And I think that's a good point to start talking about the school, is that, this was in place and it gave you sort of a guide by which to follow, although you can't necessarily follow it to the same extent that we do here.
Right. I mean, the school is obviously extremely valuable. We're both graduates. And yeah, there were things in place at the Eastman House that I wanted to follow as much as I could. And then there were things that just didn't make sense. We obviously don't have nitrate. So like there's a whole other system there with the nitrate that we don't have to do. And there's more just elements at the Eastman house. So we don't have as much, which is, good on my end. So I don't have as much to handle. But yeah, I mean, the Eastman house to me is kind of the standard. Like that's what I would want to achieve as far as like cleanliness and organization and climate control. That's really what I wanted to get to. And, on a budget as much as we could. So where one thing about Vinegar Syndrome as a home video label and distributor is we're a for-profit company.
Mm-hmm.
We're not a nonprofit. So we don't have grant funding. We don't have underwriters. Like we're doing this all on our own. So really what's financing the archive is the home video sales.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's, which is a nice thing, is people that care about what we're putting out, they're helping save these films, which I think is a really nice model.
Yeah, it's our first director of the department, James Card, always promoted films. All films should be seen and in the best possible condition. He was very Catholic, small c, in the way that he collected. If it was popular, even though it wasn't necessarily given the stamp of approval by someplace like MoMA, it was still valuable because so many people had seen it, and that was a part of our national history. So with these films that were distributed and people saw them, it's important to have them saved and preserved in the best shape as well, too.
Yeah, I completely agree. And a lot of people and institutions would potentially look down on some of the stuff that we're saving and releasing, which to me makes it all the more valuable, because that means that less people are trying to save it, and we need to.
And we mentioned that Vinegar Syndrome does put these out on Blu-ray and streaming, but it's not just transfer, right? There's preservation and restoration that goes into some of these projects.
All of them. We do restoration for everything. So, we do in-house restoration. So there's people on site that are color grading and removing dirt and scratches. And we do the scanning on site too. So we're completely equipped to kind of go from the beginning to end on a home video project, or, a theatrical. If we want to do a DCP, we can do that as well.
Which brings us to the streaming side and the fact that the title you're going to talk about today is actually streaming for rent on Amazon right now. So why don't you tell us about Penitentiary?
So Penitentiary is a movie that I really love. It's from 1979, and it's directed by Jamaa Fanaka. And for anybody who knows that name, he's most likely known, at least kind of in archive or academic circles, as being a part of the LA Rebellion. Mm-hmm. So right alongside filmmakers like Julie Dash or Charles Burnett. And the funny kind of like tidbit is, we have like Charles Burnett and Julie Dash and Larry Clark. These are these filmmakers that are kind of like studied in school, mm-hmm. Depending on where you went to school for film school, and they're like revered. And then you have Jamaa Fanaka, who was the only one who really made genre film in that group. And despite not being, the person who made Killer of Sheep, he made Penitentiary, which ended up being the most commercially successful of the LA Rebellion films,
right?
Which I think speaks to kind of, the populist nature of exploitation and of genre, but also how much those genres lend themselves to being, these like Trojan horses for social commentary. Mm-hmm. So you have this movie Penitentiary, which outwardly just looks like a boxing movie. I mean, it's, for anybody who hasn't seen it, it's a boxing movie set in a prison. Mm-hmm. Kind of like, Walter Hill did Undisputed in the 90s. And
right.
So there's this, trajectory. If you look back at exploitation movies prior to even the 70s, there's a lot of boxing and a lot of prison. Like these are staples of the genre, maybe not necessarily staples of blaxploitation, but these are staples of exploitation filmmaking, and especially low budget exploitation filmmaking. So it's easy to kind of bring in viewers to a movie that just looks like it's going to be a slugfest, and then end up having it be really rich with layers of social commentary on, the industrial prison system, on masculinity, on how we treat marginalized people in America. And I think it's a really, really beautiful, rich text that's also a pretty rugged exploitation movie. I think it's a great thing, especially with like a company like Vinegar Syndrome, is we can be confident in telling people who like exploitation movies, like you'll be entertained by this, but also bringing people in who are not typically accustomed to that kind of material and saying, hey, this is a movie that's like really rewarding and you're going to learn a lot from it, but it's also exploitation. So I think there's a way to kind of broach that this movie does really well.
I think it's important, particularly for people that don't watch this type of cinema on a regular basis. The term exploitation has been rerouted in our modern times, and I think it's good to sort of redefine that we're not exploiting the people that are making the films, but it's exploiting a market. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, when you get into blaxploitation, it's really interesting because in 1970 you have Cotton Comes to Harlem, which was directed by Ossie Davis. And then following that, in the next year, you get Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, which was actually one of my favorite screenings at the Dryden when the fire alarm went off in the opening. And then you have the same year as Gordon Parks' Shaft. And then you have Superfly the following year, and so on. But the interesting is those first few years there, those first like 3 years, these tentpole films in the genre were directed by Black men. Mm-hmm. And then following that, once you get to like the Pam Grier movies and a lot of like the Fred Williamson movies, they're all directed by white men. Mm-hmm. So it was all of a sudden, there's this kind of cinema that was coming out of this community. They were making movies because they weren't seeing themselves on screen. And if they weren't seeing themselves on screen the way they wanted to be seen or the way they felt that, their community should be represented. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of white guys come in to take it over because they realize it's making money. So I think what Jamaa Fanaka did is, he kind of turned the script, because you have the LA Rebellions making movies throughout the, in the 1970s. And their whole thing was to kind of make these movies that were similar to, what Melvin Van Peebles was doing. These were these films that were very community driven, were basically the opposite of what you'd see come out of Hollywood, and also the opposite of what you'd see in like these, in Coffee or Foxy Brown or like Truck Turner. Like they're kind of shunning what blaxploitation had become. Mm-hmm. And here comes Jamaa Fanaka, and he made MMA, which is like a really incredible kind of heist movie that's not really a heist movie. He made Welcome Home, Brother Charles, which is the weirdest superhero movie that like nobody's ever seen. Not going to give away like why that is, but people should watch it. And then he makes Penitentiary. And these three films can all be considered blaxploitation, but they aren't like dealing with the, the sort of almost parody type material that some of the other ones were dealing with in the mid 70s. So you aren't focusing on like colorful pimps or like, pushing of drugs. Like you're focusing on these like community issues. And in MMA, I mean, you have this like really rich character who's just like struggling with her place in this city. And in Penitentiary, you're dealing with the prison complex. And yeah, I think he was just doing something completely different that nobody else was really doing in the genre, as like an attack on what was happening in the genre and how people were being portrayed.
So why don't you tell us the setup of Penitentiary, how it begins and how we get into the prison?
So the main character's name is Too Sweet, and he ends up in the prison. And I don't want to give like too much away because it's kind of fun to like watch it all unfold, but he ends up in the prison and there's some sort of, I don't know if you would call it, I guess it's illegal boxing activity going on. Basically, there's boxing happening, and the white people running the prison like to take part in, kind of funding this to happen and incentivizing the black men to fight each other, which is pretty messed up and is not all that far from reality, even 30 some odd years later. It's still pretty terrible to watch it happen, but it's obviously a commentary on what black on black crime was at the time. And so you end up with this character who's in the prison, and there's this sort of older like mentor character in there too, who I think is a really like rich character. He's been there for a long time, and he listens to like jazz music in his cell. And there's this really great sequence where he goes on this he has this like speech, this very politically motivated speech, and he's got like a Malcolm X poster behind him. And I think it's a movie that's a lot more concerned with characters and kind of representing something different than it is with plot. I think people going into this hoping for like a crime story with like twists or anything, or a prison story that's like Stallone's Lockup are going to be
Yeah.
a little disappointed. Like it's not that kind of movie. I think it has a lot more to say politically than it does like narratively. But yeah, I think it's a really great movie.
Yeah, and it starts at the beginning with the political message, where there's a violent incident that happens, but Too Sweet is, if not innocent, then at least justified in the action that he takes. But because he's the last one left, he's the one that gets blamed for the crime.
Yep.
And when he does get into the prison system, the prison films have often been sort of when you have an audience surrogate going into that the prison system, and they're not necessarily as guilty, but by the time that they leave the prison, that environment has made them sort of complicit in what's going on, and they've sort of become worse by their experience in the prison system.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in this too. And I don't know if you've watched the sequels, but they sort of take that in a very cartoonish direction. Speaking to what I was saying before about like, the money being involved. And so Penitentiary was really commercially successful. And the answer to that was for studios to get involved and make Penitentiary 2 and Penitentiary 3, both of which was still directed by Jamaa Fanaka. But he turned them into like almost cartoons. And like in the second one, you have Ernie Hudson and Mr. T, and there's like a pudding incident. They're really ridiculous. But yeah, I think with Penitentiary 1, you really see that sort of how prison affects Too Sweet. And in Penitentiary 2, he kind of turns that into being this thing that like turns him into a larger than life character. Which I think is also important. I think that's like another another layer of commentary. But in the first one, we really kind of see like the mental implications of what he's doing.
And the closest time-sensitive analogy to this is Rocky, which came out in '76, and Penitentiary was '79, right? So it's sort of right on the heels of that, which is also a series that got more ridiculous as it went on. So it's, they sort of shun the realistic portions to make it more dramatic.
Yep.
I also read that not many of the prison films that were being made, sort of women in prison is a genre we're familiar with, but there weren't that many men in prison films, and certainly not Black men in prison.
No, I mean, the prison genre was, you kind of had a lot more, like there were a lot of chain gang movies. That was kind of a thing around then. And there were some, some of your prison movies were more like, I don't want to, maybe depressing, I guess you could say. Like you have movies like Midnight Express.
Yeah.
There were definitely prison movies. I think a lot more of them were being made overseas than they were in the US, at least on like a larger scale. Like Midnight Express was, I mean, it's a Hollywood movie, but it's set overseas. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of a xenophobia kind of with movies like that. But in the American prison movies, I mean, you have like Don Siegel's Riot in Cell Block 11. So you have these movies that are definitely exploitation movies, but they were often made by people who were of bigger stature. And I guess with Don Siegel, you have Escape from Alcatraz. So they were being made kind of on this scale that's a little bit bigger than Penitentiary movies.
And when we talk about exploitation, it's not just that we're seeing Black characters on screen and their life, but there's also the violence. Certainly the violence is foregrounded in the advertisement. So people that want to see an action film will know they're getting something from there. But I was surprised at how much sexuality they actually included in a men's prison drama as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for that too. And, there's a threat in there, like we see in most prison movies, especially those involving men, of the threat of sexual assault, which is definitely addressed. And you see that even like if you go to a show like Oz, I mean, that's like a constant theme. So Jamaa Fanaka didn't shy away from that, and he didn't shy away from sexuality in general. All of his films kind of take that like head on, and you see that a lot in the blaxploitation genre too. I mean, if you Sweetback's like the perfect example. where it's just like shattering taboos. And I think that makes sense. It's sort of indicative of just wanting to see yourselves on screen in a way that you haven't before, because white directors weren't really doing that. I mean, you have in the exploitation circuit, sure, but on the larger scale, like in Hollywood movies, you weren't really seeing that unless they were black directors.
Yeah, and the attempt seems to be to represent this facet of life that we don't normally get to see, and it is, since the percentage of black men in prison is higher than it is in normal society. That's a part of the life cycle that is not represented. And just the audience getting to see that and have empathy with these characters that are in this situation, I think was really important.
Well, there's that one scene that it's sort of played for laughs, but there's that scene during the boxing match where one guy goes to the bathroom and there's like a woman who comes in, it's like visiting, and like he climbs in through the ceiling, and she's like in the bathroom, and they have their moment. And it's just, there's like it's cut back and forth with the boxing match, so it's like really ridiculous because you're going from the sounds of punching to like the sounds of moaning, and it's sort of a comical moment, but at the same time it's like, if you're putting yourself in this position in prison, if you like can identify with that in any way, it's like a perfectly human impulse.
Mm-hmm.
It renders the two of them to be human, even though they're both incarcerated.
And again, I agree with you. We don't want to spoil too much about this film, but you mentioned at the beginning how there is the one black guard that's looking after them, but it's primarily white men that are not only running the prison, but also running this sort of fight club, this underground fight club thing. And with the incentive that they may be able to get them a contract to fight outside. But our character, Too Sweet, goes in without even having any boxing experience or particularly wanting to be a boxer, but he finds himself wrapped up in this just to sort of get ahead and keep the lions at bay, so to speak.
Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely like a smarminess to those guards. Like there typically is in these movies. I mean, you can tell it's not all on the up and up. Like I wouldn't blame Too Sweet or anybody else for not believing them. I think there's something to say for doing it just to kind of fend for yourself than to buy into a bargain.
Yeah, that's kind of how it starts with his cellmate. He's just sort of defending himself, but he feels like sometimes the best defense is a good offense to show everyone else in the prison that he can defend himself and to sort of leave him alone.
Yep, I agree with that.
Are there other films from the Vinegar Syndrome library that you could recommend sort of around this film?
Well, so the aforementioned Fanaka titles, MMA and Welcome Home, Brother Charles, we did release on a Blu-ray together as a double feature. We also put out Penitentiary 2, and we released Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song on a Blu-ray, which I think is, an iconic movie that I'd hope everybody has seen. But yeah, I think those are the ones that kind of like really fit in with Penitentiary. We also put out this double feature from Matt Simber, The Candy Tangerine Man and Lady Coco, and those are blaxploitation. So if people want more blaxploitation, we have those.
Well, that's great. As we said, Penitentiary is for rent now, streaming on Amazon and some of the other usual suspects. So you can go find this film yourself if you're interested. Otherwise, Vinegar Syndrome has a website. You can go see their entire catalog and see what other films that they have to offer. So thank you, Justin, for joining us. Before you leave, I would like to do a little 5-question survey that I've been doing in these conversations. Just since it's been so long since we've been in the cinema, to get a sense of what your experience is with it.
With going to the cinema?
Yeah, primarily.
I mean, I miss it. I guess is the easiest way to summarize it. I'm in the backyard of New York City here, so not being able to go into the city and just see movies every weekend is sad. But I'm also very thankful to have as many options as we do for watching stuff from home and to support theaters as well, right now with virtual cinema initiatives and donating for memberships, just kind of keeping theaters afloat as long as we can. But I'm very eager to get back to theaters and eager for it to get warmer out so the drive-ins open back up. And yeah, I'm excited to see what happens in 2021 with going back to the movies.
And we should mention that you were a projectionist as well for many years. So you have that experience from the booth as well as from the audience.
Yep, I worked in movie theaters for more than half my life, so I cannot.
I love talking in fractions to my wife. It freaks her out. So what was your first cinematic memory?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I think, it's probably older than, I definitely saw movies before this, but the one that I remember vividly is Batman Returns opening weekend. I was 7, and it was like the biggest deal. Like I was in Atlanta for it, and they did they had a life-size Batman and Penguin for you to like pose with as a kid. And it was just, it was a really important screening for me, formative years wise.
Was there a theater that you went to on a regular basis when you were growing up, something you have strong memories of going to on a regular basis?
Yeah, I grew up in southern New Hampshire, and my grandmother lived in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and there was a theater in like walking distance to our house, like a Showcase Cinemas. And we used to go there on the weekends. And even as a kid, I would just like walk down there and go see movies instead of hanging out with my family. And that's probably like the fondest memories I have of going to the movies as a kid. But it was the thing we just did constantly. I mean, I was kind of obsessed from an early age. So probably went to movies every week.
What is your favorite sensory experience when you go to the cinema?
The quiet, which means I have to go at like 9 a.m. I like going to movies, extremely early or extremely late, but typically on the earlier side, try and go for like a 9 a.m. show. I just love like entering a theater that's, maybe when I enter it, it's not super quiet, but once the movie starts, if it's like the right theater, it'll be respectful and quiet. And it's really nice to just like not have any other distraction than the screen.
And where do you sit when you go to the theater?
Right in the front room.
Any particular reason?
It's less distracting. I don't want to see anybody's phones. I don't want to see, I want to see the screen. I like having it as big as possible. It just like takes up my peripheral vision. Just nice. Usually I don't have to fight anyone for it. It's nice because I can go whenever and get a seat. I don't have like a seat that I like in the back. I'm just always in the front.
You're the second person in the New York area that we've talked to and has mentioned phones when they go to the theater.
Yeah, it can be pretty brutal. It's okay with some of the art houses typically, but if you try and go to like AMC Empire, it's just, you sit anywhere that's not the front, all you're going to see is people's phones or tablets or whatever. It's awful. So yeah, I always try and go early and sit in the front. It's just like out of sight, out of mind. So just watch the screen.
One last question, less cinematic related. Is there a book that you can recommend that people pick up while they're home, either about film history or exploitation film, archiving, that you would recommend?
It's an expensive book, but Nightmare USA by Stephen Thriller is a book all about like these regional horror movies from America, and it's great. I mean, it's this huge tome. It's like a really, really giant book. It might be out of print, so I don't know how accessible it is, but I highly recommend it. I guess as a backup, I'd recommend Bold, Daring, Shocking, True by Eric Schaefer, which is sort of a primer on exploitation. So if people want more exploitation, that's a really good place to start.
That sounds fantastic. I'm sure we'll gather all these recommendations together at some point and put them in a blog post or something with links so people can try to find these films and books. Sorry. Justin, I want to thank you one more time for joining us and telling us all about Penitentiary and about what you're doing over at Vinegar Syndrome. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you sometime again.